Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Forsythe, and I am here with Lynn, Kinney, and Major Brian Kerg, and we're about ready to kick off a lively discussion about public affairs and information operations. And welcome. This is going to be a great discussion. Lynn, Kinney, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how what your background is to bring us to this point?
Sure. Amy, thank you so much for having me. Amy and I have known each other for, going on 17 years. I've known her my entire professional career. I am a career public affairs specialist in the joint world. In the Marine Corps, I am a communication strategy and operations chief. My background, along with Amy, took me on a couple of deployments, doing photo and video journalism, along with a variety of other positions throughout the Marine Corps. And just happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and obviously Major Kerg for participating in this discussion with us.
Well, super. And a little bit about me. I started my career as a Marine combat correspondent. I currently work also in the Navy Reserves now as public affairs officer. And in my civilian capacity, I've also worked in civilian media as a TV reporter. And I've also taught at the university level, lifestyle media marketing. And I do some writing and some reporting as well. So I've served 5 combat tours, 2 tours to Iraq, 3 tours to Afghanistan, and many international overseas deployed experiences, reporting and working with the media in an overseas location. And so why this is important, as Lynn and I experienced firsthand as enlisted Marine combat correspondents in Iraq in 2006 at the height of the war, in Anbar province, we were directly impacting and shaping the battlefield for messaging and setting conditions for the commanders to make battlefield decisions based on the information that was being put out into the local pan-Arab media sources. So we had a hand in that. And so introducing our special guest is Marine Major Brian Kerg, who recently wrote an article that got a lot of attention in the public affairs community. And so we wanted to bring him on to have him expand on on what was written, what was published, but get a sense of where he was coming from. And then also talk about his body of work, his previous articles that have been published, and get to know a little bit about how you're doing that and some interesting stories. So welcome, Brian. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Amy. Master, thank you. I definitely appreciate the invitation. Asking me to be a part of this discussion and the opportunity to help improve our profession in this way. So just to say it up top, the following views are my own. They do not represent the views of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, the United States Navy, United States Marine Corps, or any other government organization with which I am affiliated. So yes, once again, I'm Brian Kerg, and I am indeed a communications officer by primary MOS. But I also do a lot of broader things in my spare time. Notably, I like to teach, I like to learn, and I like to write. I'm currently a non-resident fellow at the Marine Corps University's Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity. I'm a military fellow with the College of William and Mary's Project for International Peace and Stability. I'm currently a member with the U.S. Space Force's PME design team, and I'm an instructor with Marine Corps University's continuing education program. And as you alluded to, many of these opportunities, they arose, I would argue, in large part because of some of my writing and that body of work contributing to my ability to make inroads into those projects. To be clear to the audience, by communications, I don't mean a public affairs professional. I am not that, but more in the sense of signals, enabling command and control, or C2, through the planning of a communications architecture, utilizing communication systems, which might lead one to naturally ask, why is this C2 systems guy riding on a field that is not his own? We'll get into that a little bit more later, but some of those other activities that I just listed, they provide a broader context where I'm coming from with respect to my research and my writing interests. And briefly, in the Marine Corps, we're often told to be MAGTF officers first and officers for MOS second, i.e. be a broad, lifelong student of the art and science of war. But then we also find ourselves running up against that tension of staying in your lane, which kind of undermines the previous aim of broadening oneself. So I would say spend time in every swim lane you can, see what you might learn, and see what you might contribute. You might surprise yourself. So getting the article itself, which led you to ask me to participate in this discussion. And this is great as far as the nature of the article. So the scope here, as far as Signal Magazine, the way they frame it is disruptive by design. That's this column. And it aims to do just that. And I think by generating this discussion, we achieve that. It is pretty short. It's only 650 words, so it's very limited. But it did generate lots of reactions, which again, intent was met. And also for the audience to keep in mind, this article, like most of what appears, is aimed at a joint setting, aimed at the joint world. So when we look at public affairs in the joint context, it's important to understand that each service may have a different understanding of their role in public affairs, and each command may understand and employ their public affairs shops and their public affairs professionals a little bit differently. And again, there's lots of good reasons why that may be so. In the Marine Corps, as an example, we recently, by recently a few years ago, integrated public affairs and combat camera into a single field, which we now call Communications Strategy and Operations, or ComStrat for short. And the way the Marine Corps aims to employ ComStrat can differ strikingly from how other services may employ public affairs. Perhaps one of the most influential documents we have that kind of guides how a ComStrat should be employed now is MAGTF Information Environment Concept of Employment. That's a mouthful, which, while maintaining the lawful limits of public affairs and those roles, it really pushes ComStrat deep into the field of helping to shape the information environment in some really innovative ways. That said, the Marine Corps, in the Marine Corps, while some commands are really flexing their ComStrat and really pushing them to that edge, others might not be leveraging them to the full spirit of what that new concept of employment lays out. And without getting into each service individually, again, the different services have different needs, and rightfully so, the function should be tailored to the needs of those services. Frankly, Joint Doctrine provides some pretty great language to do just this. The most updated version of Joint Publication 3-61, Public Affairs, incorporated its most recent change in 2016. And it speaks to much of the opportunity that the information environment provides. And frankly, it's not that different from how the Marine Corps aims to employ ComStrat as described by the MAGTF, i.e. Concept of Employment. There's a lot of room for public affairs professionals to maneuver in support of the commander's intent. And some public affairs officers and PA shops out there and commanders, as far as how they're employing their public affairs professionals, they're just crushing it. They're doing exactly what these documents are calling upon us to do. That said, despite the progress made in at least what the Joint Forces published and its operating concepts and other documents, and despite what we may teach at our schoolhouses, when you start talking to more public affairs and ComStrat folks out there across the joint world, it is the case that most commanders still largely use ComStrat, or in the Marine Corps use ComStrat in a more archaic sense. That while the field is communication strategy and operations, which implies things like a communication strategy, which you might think, okay, then by phase and by stage of campaigns, having planned public affairs operations, having an overarching strategy of how you're going to shape messaging and narratives and all that great stuff. Most commanders, when they see ComStrat, they'll still read that as public affairs and don't use ComStrat personnel to the fullness of their ability to influence the information environment. And this is also true across the joint world. Again, while there are some commanders who are proactively executing a communication strategy in the fullness of the spirit of JP 3-61, and they empower their public affairs officers with the authority to release information and imagery at a rate that allows them to lead the narrative, and they plan that out with authority releases so that you know what you can release on your own, you know what you need to elevate, so on and so forth. That pace being at that level, that seems to be the exception rather than the rule. So why did I write this particular piece? Again, I'm not a public affairs officer. I'm not a ComStrat officer. I think I would have loved to have been one. It seems like a very exciting field, especially now. I think the preeminence and the critical role you have is only growing, and it's only going to continue to grow because of how our interconnectedness is growing and changing. Well, every Marine officer is told their whole career, again, that they're a MAGTF officer first and an officer of their MOS second. Again, be holistic and be fluent in the language of every MOS involved in any given operation, because that is what broadens you and allows you to understand how to be a better planner and how to be a better commander one day. And that's something I've taken to heart. At the same time, there's a tension, again, to stay in your lane. But that's not very helpful to actually achieving that goal of being more holistic and being a more proficient warfighter writ large. So in putting this into action, I've written on many subjects germane to warfighting, and lately I've been digging much more deeply into matters regarding the information environment, because the IE, which I'd argue is inseparable from the operational environment, but I get that we need a taxonomy, a language to describe information environment specific things, and that's important. But anyways, the IE, it's only increasing in its relevance to everything we do. And while there's been a lot of attention given to some of the larger stakeholders within the information environment, like intelligence, cyber, electronic warfare, space, and others, the cognitive aspect of IE is where information matters most, up here. And public affairs, or Comstrat, they play a key role in what happens in the cognitive domain. So as in looking to explore that cognitive aspect up here where decisions are made, where perception is created and perception becomes reality, because that makes decisions happen, which can impact the outcome of a battle, the outcome of a campaign, the outcome of a war. That aspect of the IE, that's what led me to get to want to dig into the Comstrat and public affairs into this discussion in a more deliberate way. Consequently, I wrote that article, and it's generated quite a response. I'll say, some folks, and this is the trend you'll see in a lot of articles that kind of, I don't want to say necessarily that I was intending to shake the apple cart, but rather that I was trying to lean forward into the spirit of what public affairs professionals should be able to do, should aspire to do per the language of some of these documents. Some folks, you're like high five, like, hey, that's great. This is exactly what I've been wanting to hear. Other folks are saying, hey, I as a public affairs professional posture myself with my commander. This is actually the same thoughts that I use to get the commander to buy into what I can do for him or her. Others, a little more adamant in the other way, saying, hey, this is not how we do business. This risks turning public affairs into propaganda. And this is not what we want to do. This could lead us down the slippery slope of being much more akin to, say, how Russia and China employ information operations, wherein the truth is subordinate to, again, winning the information war. In public affairs, per federal law, they cannot aim to lie to or influence the domestic population. We can't use public affairs to shape explicitly to mislead, rather, the American public. So there's a lot of energetic discussion back and forth across the folks I've spoken to across the joint world.
Okay, well, thank you so much for outlining, how you got to that article, and much appreciated in sharing your thoughts on how you came to write this. So in talking about that, the response, you've had mixed response. And so within our own community and in public affairs, where does the information operations or influence operations meet public affairs? And from your experience, we've had some questions, and Lynn proposed a few questions before, is that in our previous session that we had, is when you're forward deployed in an international environment, a multinational and in a joint environment, there is a tendency to focus on your host nation media and what are people saying about what you're doing. And in order to help shape the battlefield for the commander, the commanders are always going to look to the public affairs or under the information related capabilities of how to make that a reality, or what are the things that public affairs and Comstrat personnel looking out for. And so in your piece, you're urging that the information fields of public affairs can be weaponized. And so using those two words together, can you give us a caveat of what someone maybe what was their response to that, and what have you learned since you wrote that and got that published? What kind of attention that's gained through the communities?
Certainly. So yes, that language itself can seem contentious. When you say weaponize public affairs, that can take your mind down a certain lane as far as, again, the propaganda piece. So we're going to take the truth and we're going to shape it exactly how we want, even though that may mislead audiences to include potentially domestic audiences, and that's dangerous. On the other hand, though, when you want to create a vision for a commander, as far as why something you can provide that commander is useful, you want to put it in terms that the average commander is going to understand. And especially if you're talking about those that are in charge of combat operations, generally those are combat arms, infantry, or pilots, aviators of some stripe. Those that have typically employed forces that actually pull triggers, make things blow up, and kinetically dominate the battlefield in that way. So they will be able to more easily visualize how you can become an asset to them if you put it in language that immediately draws that picture for them. And I would say when you describe something you can do as this is a weapon, suddenly that light bulb might go off. So in my own community, in communications or more signals, C2 systems, that's also a common bit of contention. So traditionally, how have commos been looked at? We've been seen in the traditional sense as pipe layers. And by that I mean we enable a service, we provide something, we build a network. People can get on, they can talk, they can chat, they can email, they can do all that great stuff. And then we as communicators, we take a step back and we maintain the network, hope it doesn't go down, and transparency is the goal. We just want all the customers to be happy. Well, that's not useful anymore. And I would say it certainly wasn't useful during the Cold War, and we were at a different state then. But now when we're leaning more into the era of, again, great power competition, and we're talking about adversaries like a China or a Russia, near-peer competitors who are able to contest what we provide, they contest the electromagnetic spectrum, we can't just be pipe layers anymore, and we need much more integration. So, for example, I would need to be much more in the pocket of the S2, G2, N2, whatever Intel shop of flavor per service. Why? Well, traditionally, I'm, as a comms person, am only taught what my systems can do, how I can set up the network so that you can do your job. But I wouldn't have been taught necessarily what the bad guys are capable of doing, what electronic warfare systems they have, which leads to the question, well, if I don't know what systems they have and what bands of the frequency or the spectrum they can contest, or what kind of things they can do in the cyber domain on the network, how am I in a position to maneuver to defend that network or to change from one band to another in a deliberate way, anticipating what the enemy can do? I can't. So I need to know what the S2 knows, and we need to be at the hip. By the same token, we would then need to be integrated with the 3, with who knows the scheme maneuver, who knows the plan. I need to know that plan. In the past, some savvier commanders might have thought, okay, hey Commo, what do you think here? What do you think about that? Or give me an estimate of which of these COAs, which of these courses of action can best support the plan. And then you might say, okay, this one is best supported by what I can provide you, sir or ma'am. Well, we need to be able to do more than that. We need to be able to work with the 3 so that they know that at certain phases and stages of the operation, when we reach this phase line, for example, we are now within range of what these bad guys can do on these bands. So then we would want to be prepared to deliberately shift to something else. And oh, by the way, we need the commander and staff to know that this shift is going to happen and push information down other ways, so on and so forth. So then, and I build that argument out to demonstrate to you that C2 is a weapon system. The C2 systems we provide, that is how you C2. And in that sense, it is something you fight with, and you need to be able to maneuver with it. And when you can explain that to a commander in that way, that you are a weapon, that you are a weapon system, that you are an enabler of the plan in that way, it's easier for them to visualize what you can understand. And so I would say by the same token, when it comes to public affairs, you need to be able to make that argument. You need to be able to demonstrate where you fit into that. And that ties directly into this dangerous tension between public affairs and its role within information operations. So as you noted, public affairs, it's an IRC or an information-related capability. As such, it contributes directly to information operations, or IO, and this is all outlined in JP3 TAC 13, information operations. And you'll see in there, the J39 or the insert, service code 39, that is the IO cell. And then underneath that, you'll see all these IRCs, which includes a public affairs representative. And that's very important that that person is in there. Now, again, noting public affairs, they're charged with telling official, truthful information to a number of audiences, primarily, or to include domestic audiences. Public affairs has to tell the truth. But JP3 TAC 13, again, it says, PA, you have a role in IO. All right, you're part of that shop. You're under that umbrella too. And so there's a key difference. Yes, public affairs is largely intended for, among other audiences, domestic audiences. And it is prohibited from having a shaping type of effect on Americans. That idea, when you think about it, is to some degree nonsensical because by releasing information to anyone, you're going to have an effect, whether you like it or not. It's not back in the day where we could just put something into a base newspaper or a domestic stateside newspaper, or give it just to an American journalist and know it's just going to affect this audience, presumably, or that we're going to just drop these leaflets and it's just going to impact this part of the AO. Everything's connected. So again, one tweet, one image, one statement, one action happening on one side of the world, within moments, it's all over. It can go viral. So you can't have those stovepiped audiences or the aspiration of stovepiped audiences anymore. And then again, within public affairs, those professionals, we choose which stories we want to tell. All right, we don't just, we deliberately select the good news stories, or we craft them in a particular way, or we deliver bad news stories in a particular way. We're not just telling the truth, we're telling a refined version of that truth that has gone through a deliberate shaping process. We're not just an amplified source for information that we're gathering and just blasting it out there. We're not like constantly hitting forward to a reply all to everybody with everything that's happening. That's ridiculous, and that's not the role. That's not useful. We take that information, we put it together in a particular way, sometimes giving a certain polish to meet a certain message, to deliver a certain narrative, and then we hit send. And the only way, if we want to say about public affairs cannot influence this or that audience, the only way public affairs cannot influence a consumer of information is to not release any information at all. Whether you intend to or not, foreign audiences are watching your public affairs managed Twitter account. All right, so what your organization is putting out, their Twitter feed, their news stories, their DVids releases, everything, public affairs is inherently going to have some sort of PSYOPs, or we would call PSYOPs or MISO effect, because yes, it's going to inform, but it's also going to inevitably influence a foreign audience. And so reconciling this appropriately and lawfully, that's tough. And that inherent tension between public affairs and PSYOPs is going to remain. But both communities must consciously account for this as they do their complementary work, and not assume that these false lines between audiences can be maintained. Even in that same document, that same joint doctrine, it states that public affairs and IO, they need to synchronize, they need to coordinate, they need to avoid narrative or messaging fratricide, and that this is part of why that public affairs representative belongs in the IO cell. But because many commands may not view public affairs this way and keep them more limited, perhaps even just using public affairs as a form of damage control in some senses, that completely undermines the purpose and the full strength of what public affairs can bring to bear. Moreover, some public affairs professionals can't even get the clearances they need to be in the room with the IO cell, depending on the organization that you're talking about or what level they're going to go to. So same thing in that document in JP3 TAC 61, it explicitly states that public affairs professionals require the authority and the clearances to do this very thing so they can fully participate in the IO cell and make that weaponization and that coordination and synchronization happen. But that's often not the case. If the public affairs rep can't even get in the room to talk, say, top secret stuff within the IO cell, how are they coordinating their messaging? How are they coordinating and synchronizing to maximize their impact on supporting the commander's mission? They're not.
Thank you so much for that very extensive explanation. And I want to touch on really quickly, I'm sorry, you touched on it briefly, sir. But if you could go back and kind of touch on your deliberate use of the word weaponize. Major Ian Brown from the Krulak Center is interested. He's playing devil's advocate question here. Is weaponize the best term to capture the intent? MCDP 1 TAC 4 competing deliberately tries to open the aperture beyond military-only solutions.
Oh, that's a great question. And Ian Brown, a very, very sharp dude. So I appreciate getting the devil's advocacy coming from him. So there are lots of words we could use. And perhaps weaponize, I'll admit, is not the best word. However, I think with the intent of disruptive by design, I chose that word. I weaponized that word. I did IO because I wanted people to sit up in their chairs and pay attention. Especially for an article that short, it was really hard to get the oomph it needed to generate a discussion like this. So yes, I would say that there's maybe more nuanced ways to put that to express it fully. But if we're going to open up and come out strong and be able to get a commander to pay attention if they had not been in the past, I would say, maybe some public affairs professionals should be prepared to use that language to help get the foot in the door and move things in that direction.
We have another question, sir. We had this conversation a while back with some folks from within the Comstrat community. One of the questions that came up was the attempt to kind of get, not necessarily wrangle, but get a better understanding of what the tactical level implications are of PEDs. Can you speak to that a little bit and the importance of maybe, I guess to your point, of the IRCs understanding each other, understanding the effects that we can have on each other? Can you touch on that a little bit?
Briefly, by PEDs, you mean the personal electronic devices?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Okay,
so the tactical... If I'm interpreting that question right, I think they may mean as far as something such as having an iPhone in my pocket, which is a camera, which is a network camera, which can transmit that information very, very rapidly. So one way to look at that is, I guess a good analogy is we often talk in the Marine Corps of every Marine as a rifleman, right? And we use that to kind of, again, hone in on that, I don't want to say a trope, but a common refrain in the Marine Corps to show what our most powerful weapon the individual Marine can do if employed in a certain way. So I recall a conversation, I think years ago, I think it might have been a Gazette article talking about every Marine a collector, as far as like intelligence collection. If you're out there on patrol, everybody's seeing stuff, they can come back, they can report that, and suddenly the intel shop has a lot more eyes and ears out there gathering perhaps actionable intelligence. In this case, perhaps we could say every Marine a sensor. In fact, that language is something that I'm borrowing from another great public affairs officer, Army Colonel Miles Kaggins, and some of the things that him and his very talented public affairs team demonstrated when they were weaponizing the truth in support of some coalition fighting with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And so one of the, I wouldn't term it a line of effort, but one of the key items they were focusing on was using every soldier as a sensor. And I honestly, I can't speak to the depth to which that may have occurred, or if this was something that he was pushing toward, but I'll say I saw him using that language first in one of his presentations. So if you have every troop out there and they've got these PEDs with them and they have the ability to collect imagery in real time and get it back where it can be utilized in real time, noting that in certain environments there are going to be challenges to that. But again, C2 enablers like myself can help you get there. And I know some other teams are really savvy themselves. I know in our previous conversation, JP was discussing some of the communications means in which his Comstrat team was trained and how they were using stuff in real time. So again, if you use those PEDs, use those sensors to collect that imagery and get it back, you've got more to utilize. More so, again, leaning forward to use your Comstrat personnel or public affairs professionals in that more deliberate way. If you craft a communication strategy and you can put it down in the hands or in the minds of that tactical level commander, I mean, all the way down to the platoon commander who's telling his or her Marines or his or her soldiers what they may need to gather out there, presuming that they have the ability to use those types of devices. Again, it's like rules of engagement. It's like, hey, Marine, this is the type of stuff we're interested in. Hey, Marine, you're the person. You're basically my hip pocket combat camera person to be able to collect that imagery. So when a kinetic incident occurs or any incident occurs, we can suddenly get something back right away. And then our Comstrat or public affairs leadership can get that information and use that to support our narrative faster than the enemy. Again, the story that's published first or the story that gets out there first is usually going to have a lot longer legs. It's the Han Solo first, it's Han Solo effect, Han shot first, right? So we want to get the story out there first. And then we also want that story to become viral as quickly as possible. We want it to get, repeated. So social media can be very powerful in that regard. And then we also, of course, want to rely upon our relationships with the more traditional press and journalists to give it more authenticity as it gets picked up. Something like that, something like using PEDs in that way, with troops out at the front line at the tip of the spear, that can empower that effort in a very significant way.
Okay, thank you so much for that question. We have a few people joining us, and we're grateful that Colonel Kagans, who has written about this, he's actually joined us on the stream tonight and just made mention that, and I posted his a link to an article that he references this, and a quote from him in the article says, "It's about relentless engagement," said Colonel Kagans, "dominate the information environment with weaponized truth. I want our adversaries to react to what we're doing." And so in that, when you're forward deployed and you're engaged in the operations and you're, sitting with the commander trying to use information, this is where really rubber meets the road. And it's real time, it's effective. And we've seen this through the past 20 years, now that we're going on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, where troops have been forward deployed in hostile environment. And so we've learned a lot of hard lessons, but we know that information is just as powerful as perhaps rounds coming down range. But we've got some other people on the line. They're in the chat. So I encourage you to drop a question. If you have a question for Major Brian Kerg, who has written extensively, we can see some of the chat. We'd love to, if you could chat, drop it in the chat, and we'll take your questions. And we'd be thinking about a question I'm going to have for you as we come to a close in a few minutes, but about writing, the courage it takes to write an article, not knowing who's going to read it and have a reaction. And you've written 30 some articles and been published. What is your recommendations for public affairs or for staff members to have the courage to write? Because this will get people talking, and from your own experience, you've had reaction and you've actually been able to move the needle on some very important topics. And so let's go to the chat and maybe address a couple of the questions or comments, and then move into that realm of writing, because I think that's really where it draws attention. It gets people thinking, and that's kind of commanders right now are all solutions are on the table of what people are thinking, and we shouldn't be afraid to do that. And some of the processes you've learned along the way of how to get published.
Certainly. So I would definitely encourage other public affairs professionals to get in on this. I will admit I'm not completely versed in every service's professional journal and to the extent to which publication may have occurred. I know in the Marine Corps Gazette, we've got a lot of Comstrat professionals who have contributed some articles not too long ago, but I did dig into proceedings, and I saw that thankfully there was, in the December issue, there was a chief wrote an article about imagery. So that's great, but before that, I think it had been many, many years since the last substantive article on public affairs as a trade had been written. And so what this suggests to me is that there's opportunity there. And so when I'm pursuing my own writing strategy, some of the things I want to write on are things that might need attention, which is what led me to pick this one here, at least in what I had seen. So this is an opportunity to shape the conversation and join that debate. And if you want to get it on the ground floor, especially if you disagree, if you think I'm I'm just absolutely a Looney Tune with some of the things I'm suggesting and you want to push back, you need to do that because this is part of a dialogue, all right? This is part of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? This is how we move forward. This is so important. And that ties into, I guess, your question about, the courage to write and getting in the arena. So the first thing to reconcile yourself with is that you're never going to make everybody happy, and that people are going to definitely have reactions you might not have anticipated. I'll say when I was first getting into writing, my earliest articles, I don't say they weren't, I wasn't trying to be groundbreaking, but I was very, I wasn't pushing the envelope too hard. And I think most people would have just smile and nod and be like, well, yeah, of course, Brian. Yeah, duh. I was just kind of saying something that I think was, accepted at that point in time. And when I really started to go and widen my aperture and see some of the ideas I might have had that might have been not as much of in alignment with, the old ways of doing business or accepted common practice, that's what got a lot more reaction. So whether it was, say, maybe a talent management issue, which I'm sure many of us have a lot of very strong feelings on and can point to things that the Department of Defense or our service might be able to change to help with things like retention and other very important factors. When you stake something in the ground on that point, especially if it's going to tip over an old way of doing business, especially if that way of doing business is something that is very near and dear to the heart of the people who practice that trade, you're going to get a lot of people talking. And many of those reactions are going to be like, hey, yeah, that resonates with me. I was waiting for somebody to say that. High five, attaboy, that's great. And then other people are going to be a little bit more upfront with you about how they think you're totally out of line. And that can take many different forms. And that's something that is a risk that you may take. I think we're in a much better position now. I think the CNO himself, he wrote a call to write, a call to read and write back in 2016, excuse me, the prior CNO. And so you might think that gives you top cover, like, hey, the most senior person in our service is saying, or by the Navy service is saying that you should be able to do this. However, in that same article, he also warns against leaders setting the proper climate and not shutting voices down. And that shutting of voices down can happen in many ways, especially if that person wants to flex their collar and they may think that, again, you are pushing against maybe themselves. They may take it personally. And that's a natural human reaction. People are going to take it very personally when you are telling them, hey, sir, ma'am, your way of doing business, the thing you grew up learning how to do that very specific way, I think we can do it better, or I think we might be doing it wrong. It's natural for people to have that reaction. But I will say, I have yet to be court-martialed Billy Mitchell style. And despite anticipating or experiencing some of that friction, for every perhaps black eye I might have received for a person who was very upset with something that I've written, I've had far much more positive reaction. It could be something like a very senior person give me an attaboy. For the same article I have written where an 06 might have been like, hey, Brian, you know what you're talking about. I've had people with stars on their collar then send me an email and be like, hey, Brian, good work, keep it up. And that's great to get that kind of a high five. But it can also understand you have yet to realize what kind of impact you may be able to have. And I don't want to pat myself on the back, but I'll just point to some personal examples to demonstrate some great things that have happened. So as a consequence of a recent talent management article I wrote, an individual who is part of a Headquarters Marine Corps talent management working group tagged me and said, hey, this looks great. We're developing certain options, not just for this particular topic, but for talent management writ large. Would you like to participate? So, hey, that's great. I'll get to be a part of that process. As a consequence of an article I wrote on PME that appeared in the Strategy Bridge, that was an older one from a few years ago. But as the U.S. Space Force was charged with designing PME for a brand new service, somebody on that effort found it, reached out to me and said, hey, we think you might be a good fit for this. Can you apply? So I applied and I was invited to be on that design team, which was also really good. Some of the articles I've written on, the spectrum, to be detected is to be killed. And another article in that same vein, I was able to get pulled into a project with the Office of an Undersecretary of Defense regarding spectrum issues, and I'll just leave it there. But that was great. And then other articles might just be taken and used in a different way. I had a person who was charged with designing a certain course with Marine Corps intelligence schools. They saw an article I wrote and they're like, hey, this vignette you wrote at the beginning, that's awesome. It speaks right to one of the issues we're trying to address. Can we use this as our capstone project? And I said, hey, rock and roll. Another Navy command, as a result of some fiction I actually wrote for, and I'll credit the Krulak Center and the Naval Institute for their joint effort for their fiction contest they recently hosted. I wrote a story about Marines utilizing mind warfare in a potential future scenario. And this group, they said, hey, our flag officer has asked us to use fiction in this way to demonstrate what our command can do so that more commanders get it in this very immediate way. Can we use your story and build on that universe and basically be the part two and plug our stuff into yours? I could prattle on and on, but I will say when I first started writing, I had no idea that some of these types of things could occur. And they won't happen if you aren't writing, if you're not moving the needle in those ways. So again, get out there, anticipate the black eyes, know and reconcile yourself to the fact that you're going to make some people upset at times, but you owe it to the profession. If you have something that in your heart of hearts you believe in that you would sign your name to, I would argue you owe it to your subordinates, to your peers, to your seniors. You owe it to the other American warfighters to your left, to your right, or those who may come after you, to put pen to paper and get that idea out there and see what happens.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And you have been getting out there and sharing your thoughts. It's even gotten the attention of the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Berger, who mentioned you by name on a recent podcast with Proceedings. And so definitely getting the attention of senior leaders who are taking your ideas or your thoughts and inviting you to participate in the discussion. And so as public affairs, Comstrat, we can also encourage our staffs to do more writing, help be a sounding board, and to get them published so that it can foster more discussion about a myriad of topics. But I love the fact that you are mortarman, enlisted Marine turned communications officer, and you're writing about different topics. I did just want to mention something in the chat here. We're talking about Comstrat and when you're forward deployed and you're working in that environment, but at places like home here in the States, and garrison public affairs can be just as combative sometimes, and no easier duty is, in most cases. It's harder on the home front, and in some cases when they're having difficult issues of domestic violence or unfortunate untimely deaths of service members, and those loud critical voices on the outside are talking about you, and faster than you can catch up, really just drowning in content, real or false, real media. Everybody else is talking and swirling around. That PAO at Fort Hood, for example, had their hands full, and so we can only imagine how difficult that job is as well. So when we're talking about information environment, and you mentioned the JP 3-13, I put all that in the chat, but tying things up with public affairs and using the word weaponize, some people question that, but again, to get attention. But for forward deployed public affairs who then have to come back to the home front and work in an information rich environment, having that same essay, situational awareness, can be even more difficult. And so using information to build trust, but also use it to your advantage so you can obviously get ahead of that narrative is always very difficult, even with loud opposition for voices here in the home front and garrison.
Absolutely. So I think another way when we want to talk about, I guess, more the competition, vice the combat and vice weaponizing, a lot of what we in the department, we in the military should be able to do is not just, again, be prepared to fight battles and win wars. And that's something we absolutely need to do through, again, shaping our readiness. But by winning that battle of the narrative and letting the world know what we're capable of doing, because this is what builds trust in allies and partners. This is what lets other potential partners know that the United States should be the partner of choice. This is what can discourage adversaries from doing certain things. And really, in that vein, the DoD kind of taking a backseat to the Department of State by giving them the best opening hand we possibly can. And we can do that far more readily through that information fight. And public affairs has a huge role in that. And by the same token, here on the home front, on that domestic side, again, we might want to use different language, maybe not weaponize, maybe not dominate, but we need to be ahead of the pace in that narrative so that we are able to gain and maintain the trust of the American people. I love what Colonel Kagan's put there in the chat. The naysayers and the critics, they're not enemies. They're concerned troops, families, Congress, and curious citizens. These are the people to whom we owe those answers. And granted, yeah, with investigations and things of that nature, there's a lot of rules that have to be abided by. There are certain things you have to do before you can release some information. But as you can see, the adverse impacts of not getting the information out there and not telling the truth in a timely way. Going back to JP3 Tech 61, that timeliness is absolutely critical. And if we, because of certain other measures, we are putting timely truth on the back burner, we lose the trust of the people who are the reason for which we exist. So that fight is at least as, if not more important than the fight abroad.
Okay, sir. So I wanted just to kind of circle back to the original conversation. Selfishly, I have to say, as a ComStrat professional, can you talk a little bit about, or expand a little bit about, the need to understand these joint capabilities? I think a lot of times, and just speaking from personal experience, we find ourselves in a bubble. We look inside of what we can control, and sometimes are scared to, like you addressed right with your writing, push the boundaries. How do we, or what would you recommend for encouraging those boundaries and helping us to understand joint integration, and specifically how ComStrat or PA as a function can do that more seamlessly?
Certainly. So as far as those other functional areas, and I guess I'll limit myself to not just like, MAGTAFery and, being a holistic MAGTAF officer, but more, I guess, the information side. And this is difficult because each service kind of uses a little bit slightly different buzzword, as far as like information operations or information warfare or operations in the information environment. So in the Navy, for example, there's an information warfare community, and public affairs is not part of that. Though they are part of an IO cell per joint doctrine and per an IO working group, you may stand up, say. So it is absolutely important to understand how all those things fit together. All right, so as me as a comms guy, I mentioned before how we need that relationship with intelligence so we can understand what bad guys can do to our network. By the same token, any information warfare person, or I say not information warfare, but rather those that are, doing stuff in the information environment. So, hey, maybe that Marine Corps term of OIE isn't so bad after all. Maybe ops in the information environment is has a lot of merit to it. But so we also have cyber. So again, what can the bad guys do to our network? But what can our network do for us? Now let's go to public affairs. You are just as dependent on those capabilities to do your job as any other member of the staff or as any other commander. If you can't get the information out there, you're out of rounds, right? You can only go so far as you can fight. You can only you can only fight so far as you can drive, S4 stuff, gas, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you don't have a network, if you don't have a means to communicate that information out, you're very, very limited. So that might just be, hey, you want imagery and you want to give it some polish before you email it out. Okay, well, let's say the network's down. Let's say you don't have this big, robust architecture. How else can you get information? Maybe we talked about those pads and those sensors out of the tip of the spear, or maybe you've got that contract person out there who's observing and has a story and wants to get that truth back to the command post as soon as possible, or to a journalist, or so on and so forth. What else can you do? Well, hey, suddenly you should be just as interested in how to do single channel radio as somebody like myself, or as that platoon commander, or as that company commander. That handset is suddenly absolutely critical to you. And then also being able to understand other things you might be able to do. So get really crafty. I know in our previous conversation, we discussed something a little more out there like ham radio or amateur radio. Everywhere you go in the world, there are going to be amateur radio operators who are able to communicate that way in certain environments, like say in a DISCA environment. It might not be bad guys denying the network. It might just be there was an earthquake or a tsunami or whatever, and all the cell towers are down or are jammed, and the other more traditional means that you could tap into are down. How is Comstrat, how is public affairs going to get that message out? Well, if you happen to be a trained ham radio operator, you're golden. In those DISCA environments, we have to rediscover it each time, but eventually we usually realize, hey, there are people on the ground that have organic ways to get that intelligence to us in real time and know where the need is. How do we tap into them? Oh, this very simple tool. We just need to train ourselves in it. So again, all across the gamut of the information environment and those information related capabilities, suddenly the value of knocking those walls down and getting out of our stovepipe suddenly becomes much more relevant, especially to something as absolutely essential to public affairs professionals and Comstrat who are trying to win that fight of the narrative for us. Because we might rock it in every other aspect, but if the people we want to believe that, the decision makers, don't believe that, don't know that, don't have the opportunity to know that, then we're not in a position to obtain that end state.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all your comments about creative problem solving. I think I might need to take on a new hobby. I might need to learn a little bit about ham radios. We're getting close to our time here. Wanted to check in to see if there was anything else that you wanted to discuss. Getting in the arena. Don't know if you want to wrap up maybe with some comments on that.
Yeah, I've got a few. So the first one is don't wait to write. There are a million reasons to delay. Usually maybe, I want to learn to be able to write a little bit better. Maybe I need to learn a little bit more first. Oh man, what if developing events, they might invalidate my premise over time. Or you might be like, hey, this is really hot now, but this publication, I know it might take several months before it hits print. So maybe I should wait. The bottom line is that there's no perfect time to write. If you wait until everything is ideal, you'll never get started because the timing is never going to be perfect. There's always going to be a reason not to. Resign yourself to the risk. All those things we discussed before, or the fact that what you're going to want to say might not have the same currency in the future. That's okay. Things change. And your ideas, your positions may change. Your ideas do not have to be timeless, but they definitely have value right now. Some might be more timeless than others. Some may only matter, this year or next. But today's problems are important to write about too. Don't wait to write. Just get in there, learn by doing, and you'll be surprised by what you achieve.
Well, thank you so much, sir, for joining personally again. From a professional perspective, I really appreciate your time. And I know that many folks, not only here live, but folks that will follow up as we try to share the message and your advocacy of our community. We know that we are appreciated, and thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion, and again for you all for picking this up and saying, hey, maybe we should talk to that guy and give me a chance. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you. If we wrap up here, we've spent an hour with you, and people can follow you on Twitter at Brian Kerg on Twitter. You're also on LinkedIn, and so folks can follow you there and look out for your byline that you'll be writing. What's your next piece coming up that you have in the queue?
Well, I'll just say I recently finished a draft with Captain Walker Mills. Absolutely fantastic Marine, currently on exchange duty down in Colombia, prolific writer in his own right, and exploring a little bit about mind warfare. So that's under development, and actually another piece after that's going to be on writing. So hopefully that'll find a home soon.
Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Let's keep an eye out for that.
Yes. So people can. Folks, for joining at home, thank you for joining us on this thread. This is the first time we've done this, so we appreciate you joining us. We can't be together, but it doesn't mean we have to be far apart. So we're grateful for your time tonight to bring us into a little bit about your background and sharing your expertise with us, and appreciate everyone that participated in this discussion with Marine Major Brian Kerg, Communications Officer, currently assigned in Norfolk, Virginia. So thank you so much, and we look forward to chatting with you again real soon.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay, thank you so much.